Welcome to Have You Heard, where we talk about issues at the intersection of agriculture and engineering. Let's get started. Here are your hosts, Morgan Hayes and Josh Jackson.
Welcome. This is the Have You Heard podcast. This is episode 50. We're going to talk today about predator control. I'm Morgan Hayes, an assistant professor in Biosystems and Ag Engineering here at the University of Kentucky, focusing on livestock facilities. In my personal life, I farm in Boyle County, Kentucky with my husband. We have a commercial cattle and hay operation.
I'm Josh Jackson, assistant professor in Biosystems and Agriculture Engineering as well, where I focus on precision livestock farming. And in my personal life, we have registered Angus cattle and also raise some goats.
We have a special guest today.
Hi, my name is Matt Springer. I'm an assistant extension professor of wildlife management, and in my personal life, I do not farm. However, I'm an active I was an active trapper until I got this job. Then life kicks in. Aspiring, well, at least my wife would say aspiring goat owner.
There you
in
go.
the future, but we'll see.
Okay. So let's go ahead and get started, Josh. Before we get into predator control, just give us a quick update of what's been happening on
So
week.
working on a hay cutter this past weekend, taking part doing basic maintenance and trying to make sure we're getting ready for this upcoming season. Still doing some maintenance equipment. I had to move some calves around, so I had a couple of calves removed and getting ready for this fall or spring calving. And so getting ready to move that group of 20 some odd cows home to the home farm to watch more. They're getting ready to calve probably about 2 weeks.
And we just started our twice-a-day checks as well for spring calving. We're expecting them to start today is technically the 15th. That is the opening day of calving. We've been checking, though, for the last week, just keeping it heifers. Other than that, we picked up a breeding male alpaca, which
just one or
well, there's 2 females that came too,
Okay.
because you'd hate to go as far as we did for one animal, and so we came home with 3. So we are in the alpaca business at a level we were not before, which I don't know what that really means, but we'll be breeding some alpacas this spring as well. So. But today our topic is specifically related to calving season, but also probably to some small ruminant predator control, because this is definitely a time of year when we have lots of questions about.
Yes, it is. Whenever you have little vulnerable animals on the ground, the question of predators always comes up, and we have multiple concerns within the state of Kentucky and the Mid-South. Whether that be things like coyotes and potentially even bobcats. Very low risk I would say, for cattle, but definitely if we're going to talk about sheep and goats, it's one that you have to be thinking about. Any of the smaller ruminants and even potentially alpacas. To be honest,
My pseudo ruminants.
Yes. Maybe you're going to luck out and they'll be really mean male, and he can be a guard animal, which some folks have used success.
The llamas, I think, are a little better at
They
guarding
are
than
a little bit better. But it's all about personality, and the fight and the dog, I guess, is the saying, right? There's definitely some terrestrial ones, which are the ground, and then we also there's always concerns, with folks in Kentucky and the regions about black vultures.
Well, let's start with how we do management with coyotes.
Sure. So coyotes, there's always a lot of folks that talk about, coyote populations and the expansion of their range from traditionally what was the plains. And, they're kind of filling that void that we lost with the wolves, which, I always like to put it in perspective. You could be dealing with wolves,
okay,
which, right. In many ways, they're really a generalist. They do a lot of, they'll consume a lot of rodents for the main part of their diet, and things like pokeberries and other vegetation. But they are a predator, and we have and will have in the foreseeable future a large population of them. So when you start talking about coyotes and coyote management, the big thing to think about is if you're talking cows, calves, it's actually a lower priority of concern relative to say something like feral dogs. And I get very few reports of coyote issues with cow calves. It does happen, but a lot of the reports I get are actually more the neighbor's pack of dogs. I like to throw them all in one lump, right? They're all dogs. The thing with canines is they have a pretty strong social hierarchy, especially our native canines, native wild canines with coyotes. So if you have coyotes that are not causing a problem, you actually want to keep them around because they do a really good job of keeping coyotes that may cause a problem away. They're territorial animals. Usually the adults will defend that territory. And if you have coyotes that are defending a territory that are not getting into trouble, that's actually ones you want around fighting for you, working with you. Now, with that said, usually animals that when you remove a coyote, so through trapping or shooting, the animals that replace them are usually younger, less skilled at getting the food that you want them to get, and then it potentially opens problems, right? The can of worms. However, if you have coyotes around that are causing you problems, you want to get rid of them. So those are two things, and there's a big push right now with coyote hunting. It's gaining a lot of popularity. They just made a couple to legalized night vision hunting with night vision scopes for hunting, so their efficiency's increased. And it's kind of funny because I was just down in Logan County doing a grain talk about voles, and all the producers were complaining about all the coyote hunters.
Really?
They've gotten so efficient in their terms of removing coyotes, and coyotes are working for them, taking voles out of the fields, and their problem. So it's so they're looking for. They're complaining about we've got to remove or limit coyote season, and I would say your audience is probably on the opposite side of the spectrum. But the big thing with coyotes is they do respond because of that social hierarchy. If you have concerns, they respond really well to guard animals. They're less likely to go after your cow-calf operations, especially if you have a decent, younger, inexperienced breeders are going to be more vulnerable. That's for most things in general. They just aren't very good at protecting. So if you have a younger animal, I would say that would be more of a concern if they haven't gone through the process before. But it's every in wildlife we always say every animal has its own personality. I'm sure you guys can say that every one of your livestock animals has its own personality, so you never know. But it's one thing to be thinking about, with coyotes in general. If you have concerns and you're seeing them around, then you can go the route of trapping or shooting. I would recommend the route of trapping.
So just out of curiosity, because I've always heard the same thing, that we leave them alone if they're not bothering the herd. What are indications that they might be aggressive? I've only ever been concerned when I see a coyote that, one, is in the field for long periods of time with my calves. Like if they just go through and they're just making their paths, that doesn't worry me. But if they sit in those fields, that makes me nervous. And if they don't leave, it makes me nervous around me.
Well, yeah. So those, so what are the indicators is your question, and it's going to be situational, unfortunately. I think you pointed out several that are potentially, good ones to use. So if you see a coyote that's not really spending a lot of time in the pasture, that's skirting the edge, it doesn't want to be around you. Those are good indicators that animal knows what it's supposed to be doing, right? In quotes there. That it's probably low likelihood that it's going to cause you a problem. However, it could just be really efficient at what it's doing and knows when you leave and then goes in later. I would say, if you're seeing signs that there is a coyote that is frequenting the area, that you see it a lot, that's a pretty good indicator, especially if it is spending a lot of time approaching or watching your herd. Especially if you have younger animals, that is it really, is it eyeing it up and thinking about it? Those would be indicators of potentially a problem. And usually, in many situations, predators are really good, right? We always see the videos in Africa, like the lion picks out the weakest thing, right? So they're running the numbers in their head constantly of like, can I take advantage of the situation? So a coyote that you think is good may all of a sudden realize that I can do this and cost you some money, and that's hard to predict. So I would say that if you have a long history of not having a problem, don't do anything.
Okay.
Just let it be. Because if it's working for you, don't do anything. And that's I always tell producers, especially row crop producers, I'm a trapper, and it hurts me to tell you not to let someone on your land to trap, because it's a resource. We view it as a resource. It's there. It's renewable, so it should be used. But it really, in terms of risk level, it every time you remove an animal, it elevates that probability of getting something that you don't want.
had them watch me while I'm cutting hay before. Usually they're watching for me while I'm cutting. I usually, there's a rabbit or something. I usually try to escape. So they're opportunists, it seems like, as well.
Correct, and as you're going through there, same with, you'll probably notice that the vultures come back through after the hay, and raptors, because you're cutting up mice. There's a little smorgasbord laying in the grass after you go through, and primarily, so like right now, a coyote's diet is almost entirely rodents. So that switches over, and there's a reason rodents produce so fast, because everything eats them. And yeah, so they'll definitely take advantage. If you think about, especially that first cutting fawning time, there's now actually deer parts that are making good meals, and bird eggs and everything else.
I'll tell you what, the worst thing is when you part of a that makes me so unhappy. It scares me every time.
Where you are, you have nothing to worry about.
I know.
Snakes, but yeah.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the fear that I have.
It is, I understand that. I deal with that on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I know.
A couple turkeys go through the hay vine. It just surprises me. They just stay on that nest like you hear it coming.
Yep, evolution did not occur with machinery, so that pressure was there. I mean, it's similar to like the armadillos, that their evolved response for predators is to jump. It does not work out well for them when they're on the road. So
yeah.
it's you hope they catch on eventually.
So let's talk about some other predators. Let's see, which one would you like?
Black vulture. That's been a concern for producers and a concern of mine. I see them around.
Yeah, so we do have it seems like a lot of them, right? And they, especially when I first started here about 6 years ago, it was all over it seemed like every place I went in terms of meetings, it was a hot topic, and everyone was kind of having some issues trying to figure it out. And vultures in general, black vultures, have been, population-wise, if you look at the breeding bird survey, which is one of the metrics we use to monitor them, it's been increasing. And they're a federally protected species, with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And, I hear a lot from producers, I didn't have to deal with this 30, 40 years ago when I was growing up. Well, that's because they took a huge hit with DDT, and there weren't a lot of vultures around. But they've rebounded. They're a long-lived species, 20 to 30 years. They're kind of similar to the bald eagle. They don't mature like their first years. It takes them 4 or 5 years till they start reproducing. So it just took a long lag time there to catch up to them, to populations to grow. They are in huge roosts now. Like, I pass one in Frankfurt when I come in. That's 400 or 500 birds. And they are different from, so we have two vulture species, turkey vulture, black vulture. Turkey vulture is strictly carrion, so it only eats dead things that find. Black vultures will take advantage of situations. They have historically done that, usually chasing down things like rodents and whatever they can find that is vulnerable, basically. That has somewhat transferred over to issues with livestock production. Cows, I mentioned those personalities. Many of those cows are not the smartest of moms at the get-go. The vultures have learned, they probably originally were coming in to take advantage of afterbirth and that resource that's there, and figured out that also take advantage of this calf that's not being taken care of, or figured out that it's a really high resource for them. And there's been a bunch of work. It's been a pretty big priority in the last 5 years with USDA Wildlife Services, who's traditionally dealt with them down in Florida and Texas for a long time. And it's, those problems have creeped up, but there's a big push in basically the Midwest and Mid-South to start looking at vulture ecology and how are they moving through the landscape. We here at UK were part of that. Had a student with Andrea Durock's lab at Murray State University. We were out catching vultures, monitoring nests, and looking at movements and survival and everything else, with the hopes that we could inform, well, if is the population doing well enough that can we give producers a tool, right? So right now there's a permit structure in place with Farm Bureau that you can get a sub-permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service. So if you're having a problem, you have vultures attacking your cows, you can go out, get a permit, go out and use lethal means to deal with those vultures. We're trying to figure out, can we universally apply that across the landscape for tools, or what level can the population, so they don't go back on the endangered, go down so low that we have to worry about the endangered threatened species. So yeah, all that looks like our nest success rate was like 90%. They're going straight up. So their population is growing and doing quite well. We have, removing an animal from a federally protected list takes a long time. So, so we were definitely working on other things. We have an effigy publication where you can create basically a fake black vulture. Vultures are incredibly intelligent animals, which most people don't think about, but they are. They're right there with crows, and they can actually perceive, well, at least potentially perceive mortality among their own individuals. More than likely, it's probably a perception of or understanding that something went wrong. So if you put a vulture, an actual dead vulture or a fake dead vulture out in an area, the live vultures are less likely to frequent that area. So it's a tool they use to break up roosts, which cause their own problems, but it's one that we've been able to take advantage of and trying to get producers to use in their calving field. So you guys are getting ready to calf, right?
Yep.
Do you have an effigy ready for your calving pasture?
We don't, but I'm going to think about it now. Because...
Well, it's $20 to make, and
Okay.
if you think about how much that calf would cost you in terms of potential future income, but also what happens to mom. If you're going to keep her, she's got to get fed all that time. You're not making any money off that. So it's a simple little, basically a schematic that you print out and staple it to a piece of rubber, cut the rubber out and put some dip ties to it and attach it to a rope. And you can put it out in your pasture, so that anywhere that you make calf, you want that effigy visible for a vulture. So that may mean that if you have a large calving pasture or you have a lot of topography hills, and you need to have maybe 2, 3. But if you get it, what we've been hearing from producers, because we haven't been able to put some science behind this in terms of a structured study, what we've been anecdotally hearing is that if it's up and they haven't had a vulture attack a calf on their property that year, it's been successful. They haven't had that. Now, that's pretty anecdotal.
Yeah.
But it works for breaking it up, and I have not had somebody say I put one up and they still ate my calf. I'll take that as a win.
Yeah, so how many, like, as a percentage, are all black vultures going to be aggressive, or do they have to be do they learn from others? Do they have to be in large groups to?
So it's thought that they're learning this behavior from others, that they see somebody has to get brave enough to try it, right? And then they take advantage. That's that individual personality, and we have individuals that are more aggressive than others, just like humans. So it's thought that they could potentially learn it. Usually this is happening in groups of birds, not in it. Like if one vulture is trying to attack a calf, mom does a pretty good job of protecting it. It's usually what ends up causing problems is there'll be 20, 30 birds, and they start breaking into these little groups, and one group will come at the calf from one side, mom will chase them off, and then the other group comes in right behind her and exhausts her. And then she gives up. So she's trying to do her job and just loses because there's just too many of them. So if you start seeing, I would say if you're seeing, 10, 15 vultures sitting around your pasture and you're about to have calves in, I would get an effigy up ASAP. Also, you can go out there, you can't harm them, but you can shoot around them to scare them. You can use fire. I mean, most of the time, USDA is using things like fireworks, bird bangers, the lasers, anything to make them uncomfortable. Because if there's no immediate reward, right, so there's nothing there for them to eat right then and there, they'll become somebody else's problem. That'll be what happens. And until there's a permanent solution, they will continue to just move around and be somebody else's problem. So, but we're working on it.
You mentioned, okay, so I was curious. You mentioned like capturing something. How do you go? And they're so smart. So how do you go about that?
So there's a couple ways. So other folks were using rocket nets, where there's actually a baited carcass. There's a net in a box or on the ground. The birds walk up to it. There's somebody they're watching it, and they hit a button that basically shoots the net over top of the birds. They do the same thing for wild turkeys. A couple other birds, wood ducks, and all kinds of stuff. Our focus was looking at nest survival and the fledglings of the baby birds, right? So are they being recruited into the population that young? We were catching them right before they fledged. So we were actually at the nest sites, which are primarily old barns, by the way. So, and we're in the middle of July running around in the top of a hay barn, which is about 130 degrees if you haven't been up there for a long period of time, which I'm sure most of you have, with a fishing net trying to catch the bird that way. Which sounds ridiculous, and in one of the instances it was ridiculous, but most of the other ones it took about 10 seconds.
Huh.
Yeah, when you start thinking you are still smarter than the bird, especially young ones. So we would just come up on one side, and they generally have 2 escape routes. So we would identify those escape routes and would come in one and have the other person with a net at the other. They just run. They are my least favorite animal to, by far. Bite, we puke, they poop all over you. Anything you can think of.
Is it all birds or just these?
These guys are really worse.
Okay.
Yeah, I've handled lots of slow songbirds. Geese are not great things to handle. They tend to poop on you, and the parasites are everywhere, and they'll try to bite you. Vultures really are nasty. I don't know about turkey vultures. We didn't handle those. Those was part of the project, but the black vultures are not fun. I've heard other. We have a new faculty member that has done owl work, and he's like, when they're holding owls, you got to treat them like a loaded gun, because their talons, if they lock in, they won't let go. So he's like, the nightmare scenario is they will have to dispatch that animal to go the person that bad. When you're talking about talons that are inch and a half, depending on the size of the owl, it's major damage. So they treat them like a loaded gun. They put them away from them. So vultures aren't that bad, but we use Crown Royale bags, put it over their head to mask them, because they just sit there and try to bite for your face.
Okay.
It's great. Yeah, all kinds of fun.
Yeah, I was just curious about that. That's how that's done.
It's not fun.
Hey Josh, do you want to know anything about small? Is there anything special for small ruminants different than for cattle calving?
So I would say with small ruminants, because you're talking about, with cows and cattle, most of the time when they get to about a couple months old, they're pretty safe. They're larger than a coyote can really take down. There's always a concern about feral dogs, but that's an individual issue, and usually some conversations with your neighbors go a really long way there. With ruminants, they're always on the menu.
Okay.
That's sheep, especially goats. They never really get very large, so they're always within that potential. I can take you down kind of size. So we're about to do an actual predator workshop with the Sheep and Goat Producers Association here April 1st in Carter County that Saturday.
Okay.
And we've done a few in other counties, and the big message that we push is you should be thinking guard dog.
Guard dogs,
guard
opposed
animals.
to sheep or opposed to a donkey or anything.
Well, if you a guard animal, I will say that. So,
Okay.
The guard dogs generally are a little bit easier to get your hands on and tend to bond with the animals a little quicker, is what I'm told, based from the folks that I've talked to. I'm not a guard animal expert, but you need a guard animal. Yeah, that's the key, because they're working for you 24/7.
Okay, just have something out there, make sure they're safe.
Yeah. And usually, depending on the size of your flock, you may want 2 or 3. So when we have conversation with producers, is you need to build this into your business model, because if you don't, it's going to catch you at some point. It's going to be bad. Yeah.
People I know have pairs. They have at least 2.
And there are points in time with coyotes, especially February being mating season, January, February, they're trying to pair up. It's also a time that you can see them in larger groups. Usually they're solitary animals, except for some specific times a year, and that's so if you think about a Great Pyrenees common breed, they're rather large, but if there's 4 coyotes, that's a lot for one dog to take on, and it's also a lot for one. Think about 3 dogs maybe fighting that guard animal, 3 coyotes, and one may be over there doing the damage that you're helping prevent. So it's more about not necessarily them actually going out and removing those predators from the landscape. It's the landscape of fear mentality is they're there. I shouldn't go over and mess with those tasty morsels that are walking around next to them.
So does like a dog, because of that hierarchy, make other dogs more
Yep.
it tends to be more.
Yes. So dogs do not like other dogs. So wolves would kill coyotes kill foxes. You throw domestic dogs in there, depending on the breed and the size that you're talking about, they fit somewhere, right? So if they're a large breed that's larger than coyotes, usually then the coyotes know that that's something I want to avoid. However, I had a chocolate lab then I was living in Illinois, and when I was training her, we were out in spring, and because she was smaller, she was young, coyotes tried to lead her away from me. And it's because they do not want another dog in their territory. And if they think they have the ability to get rid of that competition, they will. So they also know that if they're smaller, they don't want that competition in that where they are, and they'll kind of position themselves away from it.
Yeah. Or, if there's a problem sometimes with dogs, like domestic dogs as opposed to coyotes. Domestic dogs will go for the throat. I can't remember where
So coyotes are more efficient killers. It's usually how the best indicator is they will they tend to go for they'll go for legs, they'll go for their flanks. Domestic dogs will grab everything. Usually they actually spend a lot more time around the face of things like cattle, and they'll rip ears apart. You'll see a lot of cheek issues and throat issues. It looks like something went after this with no understanding what it was supposed to be doing to do it efficiently. So like things like cats will go after the throat and the face, so they'll latch on and they'll try to clamp down on the throat. So it's really easy to identify. Wolves and coyotes go, like, they try to take the animal down on the ground, and then they basically dispatch it in that fashion where it's like, you can't move anymore. Good. Feral dogs, or free ranging dogs, whatever term you want to use, don't do any of that. They also lack the sense of fear of humans. Or there's not many things that scare me about walking around in the wilderness, and dogs and pigs are the two things that scare me. Feral dogs, and it's because they have no fear of humans. They don't know, really, they are unpredictable, and they just especially the more you get in one area, the more that pack issue becomes a problem. We see it sometimes. Child, unfortunately, a couple months ago, the litter mates, they get into this, like, they're perfectly comfortable, and then all of a sudden something snaps, and they do something completely unpredictable. It's just, yeah, they're just a little bit different of an animal anyway.
You do have like a situation. So if you had a bunch of dogs, they're going to kill as many as they can, or is it just have to? How bad does it get for producing?
So usually coyotes are not ones to go forward and kill more than to consume. So you see some issues with things like, for canines anyway, so things like foxes, where they'll like start grabbing a couple chickens and they'll go stash them. So they have a slightly different behavior. Coyotes don't do that very much. Bobcats will. So the cats will kill for fun, right? But for the most part, bobcats will cache an animal, especially a larger animal. They'll go through and predate on one larger animal, and then they'll cache it. They'll cover it up, and they'll come back to it. They won't generally continue to kill more unless they're smaller. So chickens is the other one. Grab a couple chickens.
Okay.
So those kind.
Got foxes, and I find they make me a little nervous, but my alpaca will be aggressive with them.
Yeah, yeah.
But it doesn't really help, because they just keep bringing more stuff back into my barn because they're going around the alpaca.
Yeah, so so one of the reasons that you see foxes so tightly tied to buildings is because it's the actual refuge from the coyotes. They have positioned themselves at buildings because coyotes are less likely to come in, because coyotes are actually one of the biggest predators of foxes. They will kill them, especially gray foxes. And it's thought to be one of the reasons many of those populations have declined. And red foxes, which is what I'm guessing you're seeing, have this are more tolerant of humans. So they'll get themselves under barns, and that's where they'll raise their young. So they found this refuge from coyotes in those kind of
Yeah, they've killed the groundhogs, but they have moved right in behind them. It doesn't really smell any better in there.
No, it doesn't smell like, but they're I mean they're eating a bunch of your mice in your barn, and so if you think about it, there's worse things that could be living under there, and they're not going to create the havoc that the groundhogs will. They will use those tunnels, but they're probably not going to make more. So they're the big concern with them is we have concerns relative to rabies and distemper. So if you have pets, so if you have cats, that might be an issue because they would be on the menu.
Okay.
But if you have only livestock,
Animals and 100-pound dogs, they'll both be.
yeah, they'll be all right. They'll be just fine.
Mention groundhogs. What's the best way to take care of it?
So groundhogs are a huge concern relative, especially to infrastructure, right? And they're putting themselves in those buildings because they think it's a refuge for predators. Because many of the things that coyotes are a huge predator for them. So they're hard to deal with. Most folks try to use things like smoke bombs, which if you read the label, they're not toxicant labeled for use for groundhogs or anything else in a tunnel. We have basically no toxicants labeled for use for any wildlife in the state of Kentucky. So the big thing with them is you can trap them relatively easy. If you know what is using those tunnels, so if you don't have family pets around or are having concerns relative to children, it's called a body gripping trap, a conibear. You can put the size is the 220 size, so it's about 7 by 7. Just put it right in that tunnel, and the animal comes in or out. The trap snaps on top of them and pretty much dispatches that. That is the most efficient way. Now, if you have concerns relative to pets, you can get a cage trap and you can put those by the tunnels, cover them with burlap, throw some cantaloupe in there or apples. They actually make a groundhog lure. If you Google it, and trapping companies it's like a groundhog. It smells like alfalfa and apples. It's the best smelling lures relative to other trapping lures. If you think about like all the pee that I put on the ground from predators. So you can use that, and that helps. But if you have trap shy groundhogs, it gets a little difficult. If you have the situation is safe, firearms work pretty well. It's usually what but that's all situation.
Right. Should be moving around about this time of year, I guess.
So you have a pretty, I've seen a few on the roads already with the warm weeks that we've had. They are one of our mammals that actually kind of goes through a full torpor or hibernation. So they are going to be coming out and moving, and usually there's going to be some level of dispersal, right? So moving across the landscape, finding new homes at this point, yet in the fall.
So we got a little off topic there. Sorry.
No, I think that's good though. I was just curious because when I walked through the steps of the dogs, I thought the foxes are one of those ones that I have that don't seem to create problems, but my alpaca, because they're a little bit smaller, especially with them when they're young, cria on the ground, because those are they're tiny.
Yeah, no. We actually had when I was doing my master's in Delaware, there's an incredibly large red fox population of our peninsula because they were protected for a long time. We had weird issues with foxes, like trapping deer for one of the projects I was working on. Up and like dart a deer, go over and find it within like 15 minutes of darting it, right? So the animal comes under anesthesia and finally goes down. You walk in, there's like a fox chewing on its tail. And you're like, what are you doing? And so you have these weird instances of them getting in trouble. But most of the time, there's not a whole lot of concern other than they kind of create mischief, which would be the concern for your new livestock because those young are tiny, but think about the aggression that mom's probably going to have.
I think that's a pretty good summary of predator control, and might have to have you back. We have lots of questions.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I was looking up and I was like, oh man, they're not that long. I was like, okay, so we'll see how this goes. And I'm happy to come back. There's so many questions that you all deal with on a regular basis, and personally not having a farm and going through what you all go through, it's I don't get to really understand some of the problems you face until I talk to producers. And I learn something new almost every time I go to a meeting. You guys are dealing with a whole suite of complications, is how I would put it. And I think you're crazy at times because of that. But I understand where you're coming from as well.
Josh, I think we'll end the podcast for today. We'll come back with a couple more podcasts later this month on hoop barns.
Yep.
So we sort of talked about barns a little bit today, but we'll come back and talk a little bit more about hoop barns, getting ready for spring and summer. So with that, we will see you guys next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Have You Heard is a production of the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment, along with the Department of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering. Discover what's wildly possible at ca.uky.edu.